Come back with us, Ethan.
You should have stayed away. Who is he? Ethan, what are you?
There he is. Stay behind me. Do it!
Ethan, look at me.
I didn't leave because I was weak.
The alarms had never gone off before. Not once in 11 years of wearing this crown. The system was built to scream only when something truly catastrophic was approaching. And in 11 years of war councils, border disputes, and political crises that kept me awake until dawn, nothing had ever qualified. So when they finally tore through every corridor of the palace in overlapping waves of sound, my first feeling was not fear, it was recognition. Somewhere deep in the part of me that had spent years quietly collecting small, unexplained moments and folding them away into a drawer I refused to open. I already knew what this was about. I already knew who it was about. But I am getting ahead of myself. My name is Ayla Vantrell. I am the crown ruler of the Threnny Dominion, a position I inherited at 22 and have held through circumstances that would have broken most people I know. 40 worlds answer to my name. I have sat across negotiating tables from rulers who wanted my territory, generals who wanted my throne, and advisors who wanted both and had the patience to wait. I have made decisions that cost lives, signed orders that changed borders, and carried the particular exhaustion that comes from knowing every choice you make ripples outward in ways you will never fully trace. None of that prepared me for what I found on a burial moon 11 years before the alarms finally went off. I was there for my mother. She had died the previous season, and the ceremony required the ruling family to attend in person, regardless of how many other obligations were pressing from every direction. I remember standing over her grave marker with the cold gray dust of that moon pushing against the soles of my boots, thinking about all the things I had never gotten to say to her, the kind of thoughts that do not come out cleanly. They just sit there, heavy and formless, while you stand in the cold and try to look composed because your honor guard is watching and because composure is something you have spent your entire adult life teaching yourself to wear like armor. That was when my scouts reported the wreckage. Scattered across nearly 3 kilometers of gray dust was what remained of a vessel that none of my people recognized. No markings, no design elements matching anything in our records, whatever it had been before impact. It was now scorched fragments and a long scar carved into the ground where it had first touched down and then broken apart violently. My guards were already moving before I gave any order, weapons drawn, spreading across the debris field in formation. At the center of it, they found him. He was alive. Barely. One of my scouts used the word miraculously, but I have always thought that word is too clean for what I actually saw. His survival did not look like a miracle. It looked like stubbornness, the kind of stubborn that bleeds and keeps breathing anyway, without grace, without sense, without any good reason to bother. He had 2 arms, 2 legs, skin without a single natural defense built into it, no hardened plating, no natural armor. Nothing that should have let him survive the kind of impact that had reduced his ship to debris scattered across 3 kilometers of rock. He was small by the standards of most species in the Dominion, soft-looking, even unconscious and covered in his own blood. My guards wanted to end it quickly. That was the law. Unknown vessel in restricted space meant intrusion. Intrusion meant judgment, swift and final. I understood the law. I had upheld it before. My guard commander, a veteran named Tessac who had served under my mother and spent years learning to translate my silences, looked at me with an expression that managed to be both patient and deeply skeptical at the same time. She said carefully, "Ruler, the law requires." "I know what it requires," I said. "Wait." I still cannot explain it with any real precision. Part of it was curiosity. Part of it was watching his chest keep rising and falling with a persistence that felt almost aggressive, given everything working against him. And part of it, though I did not let myself think this clearly at the time, was simply that I had just spent an hour standing over my mother's grave, and I did not have it in me to watch something else die that day. I ordered him carried to the medical bay on my flagship. He did not wake for 6 days. I checked on him more often than was strictly necessary for a ruler with 40 worlds to manage. I told myself this was reasonable vigilance, given that we had an unknown life form aboard with no information about his biology, his origins, or his intentions. My physicians maintained this was a valid concern. Tessac maintained a carefully neutral expression every time she saw me heading toward the medical bay. On the 6th day, he opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling first. Then he turned his head and looked at me. sitting in the chair beside his bed. And then, in a halting but recognizable version of our trade language that he had clearly learned from old transmissions rather than any formal instruction, he apologized. Not for crashing, not for the intrusion. He apologized specifically for landing on what was clearly someone's sacred ground. And he said he hoped he had not caused anyone too much difficulty by being unconscious and therefore impossible to deal with properly. I laughed. I could not help it. Tessak, standing by the door, did not laugh and instead looked at me with the expression of someone professionally committed to not having opinions about her ruler's behavior. The laugh surprised even me, because in 11 years of ruling a dominion stretched across 40 worlds, surrounded by generals who measured everything in terms of leverage, and by ministers who smiled with their teeth, bared like a challenge, no one had ever apologized to me simply for the inconvenience of nearly dying on my land. The apology was so genuine and so completely devoid of any calculation that it landed somewhere in my chest in a way I was not prepared for. His name was Ethan Cole. He came from a planet called Earth, which my astronomer spent 4 months attempting to locate before confirming it actually existed. It was small, unremarkable on a galactic scale, far outside the Dominion's charted lanes in a direction we rarely bothered to look, he explained, in that fractured trade language that was improving day by day. That he had been a passenger on a research vessel, not crew, not a scientist, just a person who had accepted an invitation to observe and had found himself suddenly and completely alone in an escape pod. When the vessel suffered a catastrophic failure, the pod had done what pods do in catastrophic failure scenarios. It found the nearest rock with sufficient gravity and aimed itself at it. He described himself, without any apparent self-deprecation, as nobody important, a teacher, specifically. He taught history to children in a small brick building on a street lined with trees. He grew vegetables on weekends. He had never held a weapon in his life except once, briefly and badly. On a hunting trip he described as something he had deeply regretted participating in and had declined every subsequent invitation to repeat. I believed him entirely. Why would I not? He flinched at the sight of my honor guard's ceremonial blades. He apologized to one of my physicians for accidentally shifting during an examination in a way that may have complicated her work. He asked, with what seemed like genuine hesitancy, whether it might be possible for him to be useful somewhere while he recovered, because he was deeply uncomfortable being idle. The kitchen staff, when I relayed this request, stared at me for a long moment before accepting it with the particular expression of people who have decided that the strangest instruction is still an instruction. He spent his first 2 weeks of real mobility learning where things were kept and where things went, and which members of my kitchen staff preferred to be left alone while they worked. He asked questions constantly, in that fractured trade language that grew less fractured each week, about what people liked to eat, what grew well in this part of the palace grounds, what the soil composition was in the unused courtyard on the eastern side that nobody seemed to have claimed for anything. By the end of the first season, that courtyard was a garden. It was not a garden that made any immediate sense to anyone in the Dominion. The plants he grew came from seeds he had somehow kept sealed in a small container that survived the crash inside his jacket pocket. They looked nothing like anything cultivated on any world in our system. Leaves in colors that did not exist in Threnny horticulture. Roots that smelled strange when disturbed. Fruits that, when I finally tried one on a quiet afternoon in the courtyard, tasted like nothing I had ever eaten before in my life, and somehow still managed to be exactly what I wanted. He shared whatever grew with anyone who wandered past and seemed curious, explaining with consistent patience what each plant was, where it came from on his world, how he had prepared it back home. He asked people what they thought. He adjusted his approach based on the answers. He seemed genuinely interested in whether his strange vegetables were actually any good to the people eating them. My court did not know what to make of him. The Threnny Dominion is built on a particular understanding of strength. Power here is something you demonstrate, something you project, something that fills a room before you have finished entering it. My generals count victories. My ministers count debts owed. Everyone at court measures everyone else by their capacity for dominance, however it is expressed, whether through politics, strategy, or the simple fact of being someone others do not want to cross. Ethan Cole was quiet in rooms full of shouting. He deferred instead of demanded. He asked people how they were doing and waited for actual answers rather than treating the question as social punctuation. When someone disagreed with him, he considered their position before responding. Sometimes he simply said, "You might be right," and clearly meant it. My ministers called him my curiosity, my indulgence, my strange little discovery from the burial moon. They said it with the particular condescension that is almost fond, the way you might speak about an unusual decoration someone has chosen to keep in a prominent place. Peculiar, but ultimately harmless. I let them believe that was all it was. I let myself believe it for a while, too. The truth built more slowly than that. I had spent my entire adult life in rooms where everyone wanted something from me. The throne, a favor, access to power through proximity to it. Even the people who genuinely cared about me did so in complicated ways that involved what I represented as much as who I was. That is not a complaint. It is simply the reality of the position. You learn to read the angles. You learn to recognize the small shifts in warmth that happen when someone realizes you are about to say no to something they wanted. Ethan wanted nothing. He asked for nothing beyond a place to grow his strange plants and someone willing to sit with him in the evenings and talk. He would describe things about Earth with the enthusiasm of someone who assumed his listener might find the same details interesting, not because he was performing, but because he genuinely found them interesting himself. The tides, the way different seasons changed the color of the same trees, a particular road that ran along a coastline near where he had grown up, where you could walk for hours and hear nothing but water and wind and the occasional bird. I started finding reasons to be in the garden in the evenings. After several months of this, I recognized what was happening and decided to stop pretending otherwise, at least to myself. I was falling for him, not despite his softness, but genuinely because of it. Because I had never in my entire life met someone in that palace who made me feel like I was simply a person rather than a position. He never forgot that I was the ruler of 40 worlds. But it did not seem to be the most interesting thing about me to him. And after a lifetime of it being the first and most important thing about me to nearly everyone, that difference was more significant than I can properly describe. When I finally told him I wanted him to stay in the palace permanently, not as a guest, not as a curiosity, but as my husband, he looked at me with an expression I will not forget, not coyness, not the particular modesty people sometimes perform when they want to appear less pleased than they are. Genuine astonishment. The look of someone for whom this outcome had simply not been a possibility they had considered. He said, quietly, that he did not understand why someone who ruled 40 worlds would want a retired teacher from a planet most people in the Dominion had never heard of at her side. I told him that was almost exactly why. The uproar that followed lasted for months. Generals submitted formal petitions. Ministers filed objections through every available channel. Soren, my sharpest advisor and one of the most formidable political minds I have ever worked with, came to me directly and said, with the precision she brought to everything, that she believed I was making a decision that would undermine the Dominion's standing across every system we maintained diplomatic relations with. I asked her to explain. She said the Threnny ruler's consort carried symbolic weight. Whoever stood at my side was understood by every watching world to represent what I valued and what I considered powerful. Placing a soft, unarmed outsider in that position sent a message she was not certain I intended to send. I told her that my mother had spent her entire reign surrounded by people who pretended to love her for her position, and I had watched what that did to her over decades, and I was not willing to replicate it. I told her the message I was most interested in sending was that I was capable of recognizing something genuine when I found it, and that I considered that worth demonstrating. Soren looked at me for a long moment and then said, with characteristic directness, that she thought I was probably right, and also that I was going to have a very difficult few months. She was right on both counts. We married on the same moon where I had found him. Some people called this poetic. Others called it reckless, given's history of the place. I called it simply the right location, because it was the place where I had made the choice that changed the entire direction of my life, and it seemed honest to acknowledge that. I remember the morning of the ceremony, the gray dust, the same cold air, the same quiet that had surrounded me when I stood over my mother's grave and watched a stranger's chest refuse to stop moving against all reasonable expectation. Ethan's hands shook slightly during the vows, not from nerves about the commitment itself. He told me afterward, with a small self-conscious laugh, that he had counted the ceremonial weapons within arm's reach and arrived at a number his body had developed a strong opinion about, which he had not quite managed to fully reason his way past. He apologized for being distracted during the ceremony. I told him I had not noticed. This was not entirely true, but it was kind. And he had been teaching me by example for months that kindness was worth choosing even when it cost you something small. The years that followed were good ones. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy, in telling this story with everything I now know, to make it sound like the happiness was always shadowed or always carrying some premonition of what was coming. It was not. Our life together was genuinely, straightforwardly good in a way I had not expected my life to become. And the goodness of it was not an illusion, even after everything that was eventually revealed. Ethan never asked to sit in on war councils. He showed no interest in the political mechanics of running a dominion, and I do not say this dismissively. He was an intelligent man. He understood politics when I explained situations to him. He simply did not find it interesting. And he had the unusual self-awareness to know that his lack of interest made him a poor person to involve in decisions that required genuine engagement. He told me once that politics gave him a headache, and that I was clearly far better suited to it than he could ever hope to be. He said this with complete sincerity, no false modesty in it, and I believed him. When ambassadors visited from rival systems, he would greet them warmly at formal dinners, ask them genuine questions about their home worlds with the curiosity of someone who actually wanted to hear the answers, and then quietly excuse himself before the real negotiations began. He never made this look like a retreat. He simply made it look like a man who knew where his usefulness ended and who respected his own limitations enough to act accordingly. We had a daughter. We named her Wren, a name from his world that he said carried the meaning of something small but capable of enduring. She had my coloring in his laugh, the unguarded kind that comes up without warning when something is genuinely funny rather than merely socially convenient. He taught her to garden before she could walk steadily. He told her stories about a planet she would probably never see, about oceans that stretched past every visible horizon and forests so old the trees had been alive for centuries, and small towns where the most dramatic event on most days was a neighbor's dog getting loose, watching him with her. Patient in a way I had never seen modeled in my own upbringing, only deepened what I felt for him. There were small things, small inconsistencies. I noticed them over those years and chose, deliberately and consciously, not to examine them too closely. I told myself this was reasonable. I told myself that every person carries habits from whatever life they had before the one you share with them, and that not every habit requires an explanation. I told myself a great many things that were just barely true enough to hold if you did not press them. Ethan never slept with his back to a door, not once, not in our own bedroom where nothing threatening had ever existed. He always knew, without appearing to look, where every exit in a room was located. Even in chambers he had walked through 100 times. Once, a new servant startled him from behind while carrying a tray of fruit, and for half a heartbeat, before either of us had fully understood what was happening. A small paring knife from that same tray was resting against the servant's wrist, not drawing blood, simply present, simply there, faster than my eye could properly track. He apologized immediately, profusely, explaining it as an old reflex from a difficult stretch of his childhood. Some story about a rough part of his town. The servant, shaken but unhurt, accepted this. I let it go as well. Because the alternative was to ask questions I was not certain I wanted answered about the Harmless gentleman I had built an entire life around. There were rumors, too, faint ones drifting in from border provinces near the edges of our charted space. Talk of human strangers moving quietly through neutral territories, asking after someone matching a very specific description, using a name that was not Ethan Cole. I heard these rumors the way you hear distant thunder on a clear day, present but easy to dismiss, easy to fold back into the calm of an otherwise beautiful sky. I did not know then that thunder always arrives eventually, whether you choose to listen for it or not. The first time I truly should have been afraid. I mistook it for something else entirely. It happened 3 years into our marriage, at a diplomatic gathering intended to smooth relations with a neighboring cluster of worlds we refer to collectively as the Ashvine Compact. These events are tedious by nature. Hours of careful language wrapped around questions nobody wants to ask directly. All of it conducted over food and drink that exists primarily to give people something to do with their hands when conversations become uncomfortable. I have attended hundreds of them. I have learned to find the useful moments within the tedium and to let the rest pass without it costing me too much energy. Ethan rarely came to these events. He found them, by his own admission, exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with the physical demands and everything to do with what he called the sheer effort of watching everyone in the room say something other than what they actually meant. He said it with mild humor rather than contempt, because contempt was not really in his range. But the humor had an edge to it that suggested genuine weariness underneath. He was not, it turned out, someone who found social performance comfortable, which made his success with people on a one-to-one level all the more striking to me, given how poorly he tolerated it in formal group settings. That evening he had come at my specific request, mostly to keep Ren occupied in the less formal sections of the gathering while the actual diplomatic work happened in the main hall. Ren was 7 then, old enough to find court events interesting, and young enough to require supervision to keep that interest from becoming a diplomatic incident. Ethan had taken her to a side terrace with a long table of refreshments and the patient willingness to answer every question she produced, which was considerable. I was halfway through a particularly circular exchange with an Ash Vine delegation about trade corridor rights when the situation developed. One of their delegates, a broad-shouldered man named Colonel Fenn, had been drinking since early in the evening and had progressed through the usual stages of diplomatic inebriation, loud, then careless, then that specific varietesse of physical that men of a certain type become when they feel comfortable and no longer feel observed. He grabbed the wrist of a young serving girl who had accidentally brought his drink too close to his elbow, knocking a small amount onto the table beside his boots. He did not grab it gently. It was the kind of incident that happens at these events more often than anyone formally acknowledges. My guards would have handled it. They were already moving, the nearest one only a few seconds away. It would have been dealt with efficiently and quietly, the way these things are meant to be dealt with, minimizing disruption to the surrounding proceedings. Except Ethan was closer. I did not see him cross the room. I want to be precise about that because it matters. One moment I registered him at the edge of my peripheral vision, standing near the terrace entrance, and then he was already there, beside Fenn, one hand placed over the colonel's wrist with what looked from across the room like a gentle, steadying gesture. The kind of thing a considerate guest might do to help someone who had dropped something. Fenn's grip on the serving girl opened. She stepped back, unmark on her wrist, moving away from the table with the particular practiced smoothness of someone who had learned to make an exit without drawing attention to the reason for it. Ethan said something to Fenn. I was too far away to hear the words, whatever it was. It was quiet enough that no one at the surrounding tables registered it as anything beyond a brief, private exchange between two men who apparently knew each other. Fenn's face went several shades paler in the space of a breath, and then he sat back down, straightened his jacket, and did not speak again for the remainder of the evening. He left early. He did not say goodbye to anyone. Later, after Ren was asleep and the last of the delegation had been escorted to their quarters, I asked Ethan about it. We were sitting in the garden in the dark, which had become our preferred way to end complicated days, the kind of quiet that did not require filling with anything. He was trimming dead growth from one of his plants with the focused attention he gave to anything in that garden, and when I described what I had seen, he looked up briefly and then back at his work with the easy expression of someone recounting something minor. He said he used to break up arguments between students at the school where he had taught. He said that when you spend enough years dealing with adolescents who are physically larger than you have the authority to simply command, you learn pretty quickly how to de-escalate things before they become something that requires actual force. He said it with a small self-deprecating laugh, the kind that invites you to find it mildly funny. And I did find it mildly funny. And I did not think about it further that evening. I did not think. Specifically, to ask how a man who had never trained in any physical discipline could have moved across a crowded room so quickly that my own guards had not registered the movement until it was finished. I did not ask what he could possibly have said quietly to a trained military officer that had left the man pale and silent for the rest of the night. I did not ask how his hand, placed over Fenn's wrist with what looked like such casual ease, had managed to produce a result that my guards, several seconds behind him, would have required considerably more visible effort to achieve. I let it go. I got very good at letting things go in those years. The pattern repeated itself enough times that I began to develop, without consciously naming it, a kind of practiced inattention, a habit of noticing a thing and then deliberately not examining it further. It was not dishonesty. Exactly. It was more like a choice I kept making quietly in small, repeated moments, to preserve something I valued more than the answers those questions might produce. The incident with the courier happened about a year after the diplomatic gathering. A man arrived at the palace claiming to represent a border settlement in a land dispute, requesting a private audience with me to deliver documents related to the matter. The claim was plausible enough. We handled dozens of such requests in any given season. and the security protocols for standard courier access were thorough but not extreme. He was searched at 2 checkpoints. Nothing was found. He was admitted to the public reception corridor, a long hallway between the outer courtyard and the main palace entrance, where guests wait to be formally received. Ethan happened to be walking through that same corridor with Ren on his shoulders, humming something I did not recognize. One of those songs from his world that he kept in his memory the way some people keep pressed flowers, fragile and portable, and carried simply because the loss of them would be too much to accept. He stopped walking. He stopped with 3 full seconds remaining before the courier reached for something beneath his jacket. I want you to understand the significance of that number. My finest guards, trained from childhood in threat recognition, the specific discipline of reading bodies and spaces and the microexpressions that precede violence, did not begin to react until the object was already half drawn. 3 seconds in threat assessment is not a short window. It is an enormous one. The difference between a situation controlled and a situation desperate. Ethan set Ren down. He told her in a completely level voice to stand very still and not move until he came back to get her. She obeyed. Because he was her father, and he had never used that particular voice before. And children understand tone even when they do not understand circumstances. What followed is difficult to describe precisely even now. It happened too quickly for linear accounting. The courier ended up disarmed, restrained against the corridor wall, physically uninjured but completely immobilized. Before the nearest guard had finished drawing her own weapon, there was no shouting. There was almost no sound at all except the soft impact of the courier's back meeting the wall and then silence. I arrived in the corridor less than a minute after the guards sent word. Ethan was crouched in front of Ren, checking her over with his hands on her shoulders, asking her quietly if she was all right. She said yes, and then asked him what had just happened, and he told her, calmly and with impressive matter-of-factness, that someone had come to the palace who should not have been let in, and that it was handled now, and that they should go tell her tutor she needed a rest from lessons because both of them had had enough excitement for one day. She accepted this with the pragmatic trust of a child who had decided her father's judgment was reliable. I looked at the courier, still restrained against the wall, being processed by my guards. I looked at the corridor around us, undisturbed. I looked at my husband, standing up from where he had been crouching, brushing some invisible dust from his jacket with the expression of a man who had just done something mildly inconvenient but necessary, like fixing a stuck door or moving furniture that had been placed in the wrong spot. He turned to me, and the expression he was wearing was not fear, not the particular bright-eyed, unsettled quality that adrenaline produces in people encountering genuine danger for the first time. It was composed, almost, if I am being honest about it now, slightly bored. The expression of someone for whom this particular type of situation had simply, at some point in a life I did not have access to, stopped being novel. He apologized to me. Of course, he said he did not know what had come over him, that seeing Ren nearby must have triggered something instinctive. He said it with genuine warmth and with the apologetic sincerity that had always been one of the things I loved most about him. The way he treated an apology as something that actually cost him something rather than just a phrase to deploy for social convenience. I accepted the explanation. I accepted it because the alternative was to sit down with everything I had noticed over the past several years and assemble it into something I was not ready to look at directly. General Vass did not accept it. He requested a private meeting with me 3 days after the courier incident. In a way that made it clear he had been waiting for an appropriate moment rather than reacting impulsively to what he had witnessed. Vask had served under my mother before he served under me. And one of the things I had always valued about him was his particular brand of directness. He did not approach uncomfortable subjects obliquely. He named them and then waited to see what you did with the naming. He told me that something about my husband did not sit correctly with him. He told me this with the care of someone who understood the weight of the words and had chosen to say them anyway, which meant he had decided the concern was worth the risk of how I might receive it. I gave him credit for that, even as I prepared my response. He said he had spent decades learning to recognize a particular quality in certain soldiers, the ones who had moved past a threshold of exposure to violence that most people never reach. He said it was not something you could train into someone deliberately, not really, though programs sometimes tried. He said it was something that accumulated over time and experience and left a specific mark on how a person moved through space, how they processed threat information, how they stood in a room when something unpredictable was happening nearby. He said Ethan Cole moved like someone who had been living on the far side of that threshold for a very long time. I told him, with the same firmness I would have used on anyone making an accusation I found groundless, that Ethan was a teacher, a gardener, a man who grew vegetables and taught our daughter that kindness mattered more than strength, and that perhaps the habit of looking for soldiers in every quiet man who happened to protect his family was a tendency Vask should examine carefully in himself before directing it at people who had given him no real cause. Vask did not argue with me. He never argued for the sake of it. He simply looked at me with an expression that sat somewhere between resignation and the particular sadness of someone who has said the only thing they had to say and must now wait to see whether it was heard. He left me to think. I did not think about it, not directly. That is the honest accounting of it. The rumors from the border provinces continued to arrive during this same period, and I continued to receive them with the same deliberate distance I had been maintaining for years. Traders moving through our outer territories spoke of strangers, human in appearance, though not connected to any charted route that my people could verify, asking questions in small settlements along the far edges of our space. Always the same questions, always about a man matching the same description, always using a name that was not Ethan Cole. Some traders said the name was Widow. Others heard something closer to Warden. The reports were inconsistent enough that it was genuinely easy to explain them as confused accounts distorted through multiple translations. The kind of garbled intelligence that accumulates along any active trade route and rarely means what it first appears to mean. I brought it up with Ethan exactly once. We were having a quiet dinner after Ren had gone to bed, the kind of evening I had come to value more than almost any other part of my life. Just the two of us with food he had grown and cooked himself and no particular agenda except whatever we happened to want to talk about. I mentioned it carefully, framing it as the minor oddity it probably was. Watching his face while I described what the traders were reporting. He was good. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to say that I should have seen through him immediately. And the truth is more complicated. He was genuinely good at this. Whatever this was, there was a shift in his eyes. Brief enough that I might have missed it if I had not been paying close attention in that particular moment. Something that looked like exhaustion. The kind that is not about being tired, but about carrying something for a long time and feeling the weight of it freshly in an unexpected moment. It lasted less than a breath. Then he smiled and told me that Earth was a considerably larger and stranger place than most people in the Dominion had cause to understand, and that plenty of humans probably shared similar physical features when described at secondhand across multiple translation filters. And that confused traders misidentifying people was likely the most boring possible explanation, which usually meant it was the correct one. He said it lightly. He picked up his fork again. He asked me what I had thought of the dish and whether the flavoring was too strong, because he had tried something slightly different with the spicing, and he was not entirely confident it had worked. I told him it was perfect. I let the other thing go, again, deliberately, consciously, with full awareness that I was making a choice. I understand now, with the clarity that only arrives after the fact, why I kept making that choice. I had something I had not expected to have. Not just a marriage, but a particular quality of daily life that I had not believed was available to someone in my position. Mornings in the garden with Ren. Evenings where the palace felt like a home rather than an institution. A person who sat across from me at dinner and was interested in me rather than in what I represented. I was not willing to risk losing that for the sake of questions that might have answers I could not unknow. This is not an excuse. I am not offering it as one. It is simply what is true. Ren began asking questions during this period that I myself had avoided asking. Children have a capacity for the direct question that adults learn to suppress out of social training and self-protection. She had not yet fully learned either. She asked her father one evening, with the matter-of-fact curiosity of someone who simply wanted information rather than any particular answer, why he always chose to sit in the part of a room where he could see the door. He told her that old habits were like that. That once you had been in enough situations where knowing where the exit was had mattered, your body started doing the work of finding it without being asked. She considered this, and then asked whether something bad had happened to him before he came to live with us. He said yes, some things had, a long time ago. He said that the best way to deal with hard things from the past was to understand that they had made you what you are now, and that what you were now was what mattered. She said, with the ruthless practical instinct children possess. that she was glad whatever hard things had happened had not killed him before her mother arrived. He laughed at that. The real kind, the unguarded kind, and pulled her close and told her that some days, so was he. I was standing in the doorway when this happened. Neither of them saw me. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to, watching them together, before turning away quietly. I thought it was a small window into the past he had been careful not to show me directly. I did not understand yet that it was also, in its way, a window into what was coming. There was a visiting scholar from a distant cluster, a few months later, who said something at a formal dinner that I have thought about many times since. He was discussing military theory, which he clearly found fascinating and which he assumed everyone else found equally fascinating. And he made an offhand remark, the kind of remark people make when they think they are among people who will agree with them, about how easily a species without natural defenses could be subdued by any sufficiently organized enemy. He glanced toward Ethan when he said it. The glance was not subtle. It had the particular quality of a man making a point he wanted witnessed being received. Ethan smiled politely and continued eating and said nothing. I watched his jaw, though. I watched the way his shoulders sat in the aftermath of that remark, very slightly higher than usual. Attention held and controlled with the practiced ease of someone who had developed the practice over a very long time. I had learned to read him over years of evenings together, and I knew the difference between him letting something pass because it was not worth addressing and him letting something pass because addressing it would require explaining something he was not willing to explain. Walking back to our chambers afterward, I mentioned it gently. I said the scholar had seemed to be trying to get a reaction from him, and that I hoped he had not found the remark upsetting. He was quiet for a moment, which was also something I had learned to read. He chose his words with the particular care of someone navigating between honesty and omission. He said the scholar was not entirely wrong. He said soft things could be conquered. He said that was simply a fact of the universe, not a particularly brave observation. But he said that the ones who survived long enough to stop being soft rarely talked about what that process had actually cost them, because it was not, on balance, something worth celebrating. He said it looking straight ahead, his voice even. And then he changed the subject before I could respond to it. That was the closest he ever came, in all our years before the alarms went off, to telling me the truth directly. I did not hear it as what it was. I heard it as the sadness of a man who had come from a difficult place and was grateful to have left it behind. I put my hand in his, and we walked the rest of the way to our chambers in the comfortable quiet that had become one of my favorite things about my life. The final months before everything changed were, on the surface, the most peaceful we had known together. Ethan expanded the garden further that season than he ever had before, converting a second courtyard with the permission of my groundskeeping staff, who had long since given up trying to understand what he was growing and simply provided whatever soil amendments he requested without further inquiry. He grew things that required extraordinary patience, plants that took months to produce anything visible and that he tended with a consistency that struck even me, who had watched him tend that garden for years, as something beyond simple hobby or affection. Wren helped him most mornings. She had inherited his patience in the garden, which had not come from me, and watching them work together in the early light was one of those images I stored carefully because I understood, even then, that it was the kind of thing worth keeping. He grew quieter in the evenings during those months, not unhappy, not distant in any way that felt like withdrawal from me or from our life together. More like someone standing at a window watching weather form on the horizon with the awareness of someone who knows what that particular shape of cloud tends to mean, and who is simply noting it, cataloging it, deciding privately what preparations are worth making. I noticed this. I attributed it to the kind of passing mood that everyone is entitled to without explanation. I did not ask about it in any way that pressed for a real answer. One particular evening, not long before everything finally broke open, I asked him quietly whether he was happy, whether some part of him, in honesty, regretted the life we had built here and the life he had left behind on whatever trajectory had ended on that burial moon before I found him. He took my hand. He looked at me with an expression I now understand more completely than I did then, something that was entirely genuine and entirely incomplete at the same time, the way a thing can be fully true and still not be the whole truth. He told me that everything before me had been preparation for this. For Wren, for the garden, for the quiet life he had not believed he had any right to expect. I believed him completely. I still believe him now, because it was true. It simply was not, as I would come to understand soon enough, the only true thing there was to say. The morning it happened began with a sound I had never heard before. Not the alarms. Not yet. Those came later. What came first was a silence, which is perhaps stranger to describe but more accurate to what I experienced. I was in the council chamber with Minister Soren, reviewing trade agreements from two outer systems that had been sitting unresolved for longer than either of us was comfortable admitting, when the ambient sound of the palace simply stopped, not dramatically, not all at once. More like the way a room changes when everyone in it has just understood something at the same moment. That particular quality of collective held breath that you feel before you hear it. Soren looked up from her documents at the same time I did. Then General Vask came through the chamber door without knocking. In 11 years of service to me, Vask had never entered a room I occupied without being formally announced first. It was not ceremony for the sake of ceremony. It was a discipline he had maintained since my mother's time, a commitment to the protocols that kept large institutions from sliding into the casual sloppiness that preceded real failures. When he came through that door without a knock, without an announcement, with his face carrying an expression I had only seen on him once before, on the day my mother died, I was already standing before he finished crossing the room. He told me that our outer defense grid had gone dark. He said it with the measured precision of a man who has chosen his words carefully, precisely because the situation they are describing does not have good words available. The outer defense grid was not a system that went dark. It had been built across 3 generations of Dominion engineering and had survived conflicts, magnetic interference events, and equipment failures of every variety that our engineers had been able to anticipate and test against. It monitored an enormous sweep of space at our borders, and it had never, in the entire recorded history of its operation, simply stopped. I asked him how much of it. He said an entire sector, and that something had crossed the boundary within that window without triggering a single one of the remaining systems outside the affected area, which should not have been possible, which was, in fact, specifically designed to be impossible. Our outer grid was built so that losing any part of it would automatically increase sensitivity across the adjacent sections, a redundancy meant to ensure that a localized failure could not be exploited as a blind spot. Whatever had crossed our border had moved through the dead sector and then somehow continued without registering on the heightened systems that should have caught it on the other side. I asked him what he meant by something. He said he did not yet know what it was, only that it was large and that it was moving toward the capital. We reached the observation deck in time. I have tried many times since to describe what I saw descending through our atmosphere that morning, and I always run up against the same limitation, which is that the vocabulary available for describing ships and vessels and flying objects carries expectations of familiarity that this thing did not satisfy. It was dark, angular in a way that felt deliberate rather than functional, and it moved with a silence that was not simply the absence of sound, but something that felt like an active quality, as though the silence itself was being produced intentionally, the way you might produce calm or produce pressure. It did not look like it was falling through our sky. It looked like it had decided our sky was an acceptable place to be, and had communicated this decision to the sky itself, and the sky had agreed. Soren's hand found my arm. She asked me, in a voice stripped of its usual precision down to something more fundamental, who these people were. I did not have an answer. The vessel settled into the central plaza of my capital with a finality that I felt in my chest. Its shadow swallowed 3 entire buildings. From the opening in its hull, figures emerged. Human shape, or close enough that the distinction barely registered against everything else happening. Dressed in matte armor that carried no insignia, no markings. Nothing that would have told me anything about their origin or their affiliation or their intent. They moved in a coordinated silence that made my own guards, now flooding into the plaza from every access point available, look slightly improvised by comparison. Their leader walked out ahead of the others without armor. He was tall, gray-haired, and he moved with the particular quality of someone who has been in a great many situations of exactly this kind, and has learned that projecting calm is more effective than projecting threat. He wore a translator device on his collar, and he used it with the ease of someone accustomed to addressing people who did not share his language. He introduced himself as Colonel Marlowe Hale, representing an organization he named the Ashen Directive. He said he was here to collect an asset. He said it with that exact word, asset, and in the same tone you might use to describe a misplaced piece of equipment. Not hostile, not aggressive. The tone of someone conducting a straightforward administrative retrieval who would prefer to complete the process without unnecessary complication, but was fully prepared for complication if it became necessary. I told him, in the voice I have spent 11 years developing for exactly this category of situation, that he had made an error crossing into sovereign Threnny territory with an unannounced vessel, and that he needed to identify what asset he believed existed within my borders, and that he needed to withdraw his ship immediately or prepare to deal with the full response of my armed forces. He told me the asset's name. It was not Ethan Cole. It was a designation, clinical and compressed, the kind of identifier that belongs to a file or a weapon rather than to a person who grew vegetables and told our daughter bedtime stories about oceans she would probably never see. My hands were steady. I have trained them to be steady in situations where steadiness is something you choose rather than something you feel. I told him no such asset existed within my palace, and I turned to Vask, and I gave the order to mobilize every available unit. Within minutes, the plaza was surrounded, weapon emplacements at every angle, ground forces at every entrance. My soldiers spread across rooftops and elevated positions with the practiced efficiency of people who had trained for threats considerably more familiar than this one. Whatever Hale had brought with him, we outnumbered it. That was the calculation I was working from, and in the context of any conflict I had ever managed before, it was the kind of calculation that resolved things. Hale watched all of this with the patience of someone watching a process they had already anticipated and were simply waiting to finish. He said my forces were welcome to try. He said it without contempt and without particular warmth. He said it the way a person states a fact they are comfortable with. Then he told me his organization had not crossed an uncountable distance and breached a defense grid that had never been breached before in order to conduct a negotiation. He said the asset would be returned to the directive within 60 seconds of his request, or the capital would be considered a legitimate engagement zone. I turned to respond and found Ethan standing directly behind me. I had not heard him arrive, not a footstep, not a breath, not the small atmospheric displacement that movement through enclosed space usually produces. He was simply there. The way something is there when you are not quite tracking all the edges of your perception, and you look back to find the thing has been present longer than you realized. Wren was not with him, which I noted before anything else. He had already moved her somewhere safe. He had done this before coming to find me, which meant he had understood what was happening and had assigned it a priority structure before I had even finished processing the initial information. His face was different. This is the part I have gone back to most often in the time since, trying to find words for something that resisted easy description. He looked like himself. That is important to say. The face was the same face. The eyes were the same eyes. The person standing in front of me was undeniably and completely my husband, but the quality of that face had shifted in a way I could feel before I could name. Like a room that contains the same furniture, but the light source has changed. And everything is recognizable and nothing is quite the same. The softness was still there, but it had pulled back, receded in the way that water recedes before something larger, revealing something underneath that had clearly, I now understood, always been there, patient, capable, and utterly, completely unafraid. He told me, in a voice quieter and steadier than I had ever heard from him, to take my guards and move to the reinforced section at the rear of the palace. He said it with the directness of someone issuing an instruction they expected to be followed without requiring justification. For one disorienting moment, standing in my own palace, looking at the man I had shared my life with for 11 years, I did not recognize who was speaking. I told him I was not going anywhere. I told him I did not abandon my capital while an unknown force occupied its central plaza. I told him I needed him to explain to me right now who Colonel Marlowe Hale was, what this asset designation meant, and why a vessel capable of bypassing our entire defense network had come to my city looking for him by a name I had never heard. He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that contains something too large for whatever words are available. He said he was sorry. He said he had hoped, genuinely and specifically, that this day would never come. He said he had built our entire life together on the belief that he had gone far enough and stayed quiet enough and chosen peace completely enough that his past would eventually stop being interested in him. He said he had not had enough time to explain before, and he might not have enough time to explain now. Colonel Hale's amplified voice moved across the plaza before Ethan could say anything further. The 60-second deadline, announced without particular emphasis, as though it were a scheduling note rather than a threat. I watched my husband close his eyes. He took one slow breath, the kind of breath that is not about air but about choosing something deliberately, the way you might gather yourself before lifting something heavy. Then he walked toward the edge of the observation platform with an evenness in his stride that had no hesitation in it whatsoever. I grabbed his arm. I told him he was a teacher, a gardener, a man who had never held a weapon in the 11 years I had known him, and that whatever he believed he could do against an armored force with a warship at their backs was going to get him killed in the central plaza of our capital, while our daughter was somewhere in this building waiting to find out whether her father was coming back. He stopped. He turned back to me, and I saw it for the first time clearly. The thing I had been choosing not to look at directly for years. Not with fear. Not with the gentle patience that had characterized every exchange we had ever had. Something colder, older, and more settled than anything I had seen in his face before. Something that had been accumulated rather than inherited. The particular quality of a person who has been through enough that they have stopped being afraid of the category of thing that is currently happening. He said he had never lied to me about who he was. He said everything I had seen. The garden, the patience. The man who apologized too much and grew strange vegetables and taught our daughter that kindness was stronger than most things, was real. All of it was real. He had not performed any of it. He had not constructed it to deceive me. It was who he was, genuinely and completely. But he said there was another part of him, one that had existed before the garden and before our daughter and before the burial moon. One he had spent 11 years trying to keep as far below the surface as he could manage, and praying I would never need to see. He said today. Unfortunately, I was going to see it. Then he turned toward the plaza and Colonel Hale's soldiers began to advance. My forces responded immediately. The plaza became a storm of light and sound. Energy weapons discharging against armor that absorbed considerably more punishment than its appearance had suggested. The particular chaos of a large-scale engagement happening in an enclosed urban space, where sound bounced between buildings and made it nearly impossible to track what was happening where. Ethan was in it before I had processed that he had moved. I watched him cross the distance between the observation platform and the leading edge of Hale's advance with a speed that my brain initially rejected as a misread of what I was seeing. A trick of angle or distance, or the disorienting quality of the light from the weapon discharges. But it was not a misread. He covered that ground in what should have been an impossible interval. And when he reached the first of Hale's soldiers, he did something that I spent the next several minutes watching and still could not fully parse in real time. He did not fight them in any way that resembled how I understood fighting. My people practice forms of combat that prioritize force, leverage, and the overwhelming of an opponent's capacity to respond. We train our soldiers to strike harder and faster, and with more concentrated power than their opponents can absorb. It is a model of conflict as a contest of pressure. What Ethan was doing was not that. Each of his movements looked less like an attack than like a response. An answer to something his opponent had committed to before they had finished committing to it. He was not meeting force with force. He was redirecting it, using the momentum already present in his opponent's movements and simply changing where that momentum was going. A strike aimed at him arrived somewhere else and carried its originator with it. A grapple became a lever. An advance became a fall, controlled and precise, ending with the advancing soldier on the ground and unhurt but entirely unable to continue. He moved through the advancing formation the way something moves through a space it understands thoroughly, not with aggression but with a kind of navigational confidence, always knowing where the next decision was coming from before it arrived, always positioned to answer it before it was fully stated. My own soldiers stood at the edges of the plaza. I noticed this from the observation platform with a distant part of my attention that was still tracking everything, the part that never stops being a ruler regardless of what else is happening. My trained warriors, people who had served in real engagements across multiple systems, were standing with their weapons lowered, watching, not frozen from shock, not paralyzed by fear, watching, with the specific attention of people who recognize they are seeing something that does not fit any category they have been trained to process, and who have enough professional experience to understand that this means they should observe rather than interfere. Vask appeared beside me at some point during the engagement. I did not notice when he arrived. His face, when I turned and registered him standing there, had an expression I had never seen from him in all the years he had served under me. Not fear and not admiration exactly, though both were present. Something more complex, The look of a man revising a very large assumption and finding the process both necessary and deeply uncomfortable. He asked me quietly what my husband had been before the burial moon. I told him honestly that I no longer knew, that perhaps I had never known. Hale's soldiers were not untrained. I want to be accurate about that, because what happened in that plaza would be easier to explain if they had been ordinary soldiers unprepared for any real resistance. They were not ordinary soldiers. They moved with the coordinated precision that spoke to serious and sustained training. They communicated efficiently during the engagement, and they adapted their approach as the situation changed. Under normal circumstances, against any force I was familiar with, they would have presented a serious problem. Against my husband, their training seemed to be producing the opposite of its intended effect. The more precisely they coordinated, the more information they were giving him about where the next decision was going to come from. When roughly half of Hale's ground force was down, disabled with a consistency that bordered on methodical, the colonel raised a hand. The remaining soldiers pulled back several paces, weapons still raised, still ready, but no longer advancing. The plaza settled into a strange suspended quiet, interrupted only by the sound of people catching breath and the distant activity of my guards at the perimeter. Hale called out across the plaza to Ethan directly, using that same cold designation, the one that sounded like something you would assign to a piece of equipment rather than a person. His voice through the amplifier was entirely conversational. He said his organization had not expected an easy collection. He said they had prepared specifically for exactly this outcome. He said the continued resistance was, in his view, both expected and entirely unnecessary. Then he gestured toward the warship. The hatch opened wider than it had before, wider than the departing soldiers had needed. And from inside the vessel something emerged that stopped Ethan completely. Not slowed him, not gave him pause, stopped him. Standing in the middle of a plaza he had just moved through as though it were familiar territory. He went entirely, absolutely still. I was watching his face when it happened. I was watching closely enough that I saw the exact moment the stillness arrived. And what I saw in his expression in that moment was not fear. It was something I had never seen from him before in any situation or any context across 11 years of knowing him. It was something that looked very much like the recognition of something he had hoped, for a very long time, he would never have to look at again. I did not yet understand what had emerged from that ship. I did not yet understand why it had produced this specific response in a man who had just single-handedly walked through an armored engagement without visible concern. What I understood, standing on the observation platform with Vask beside me and Soren somewhere behind me and my entire capital watching in stunned silence, was that whatever came next was not going to resemble anything that had come before. I thought about all the small things I had chosen not to examine: the knife against a servant's wrist, the courier against the corridor wall, the way he always knew where the exits were, the rumors from the border provinces using names that were not his name. Every fragment I had folded carefully into the story I had built around my harmless, gentle husband rose to the surface of my mind at once, and for the first time I allowed myself to see them not as separate incidents to be individually explained away, but as parts of a single picture I had simply, for 11 years, refused to assemble. The picture was assembling itself now, whether I was ready or not. What emerged from the warship was a person. I had expected, in that suspended moment between Hale's gesture and whatever came next, something mechanical, a weapon of some kind, something designed to overwhelm the advantage Ethan had demonstrated. My mind had been building toward that expectation through the entire engagement, looking for the escalation point, the thing Hale had been holding back precisely because he knew everything that had come before it would not be sufficient. What stepped down from the open hatch was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the same quality of stillness that Ethan carried, that particular absence of wasted motion that I had spent years watching in my husband without ever fully naming what I was seeing. He wore the same matte armor as Hale's soldiers, but marked across the left shoulder with a single band of color, dark red, that distinguished him from the rest in a way that clearly meant something to everyone present except me. He did not carry a visible weapon. He walked across the plaza toward the center with a deliberateness that was not hurried and not slow, just exactly what the situation called for, as though he had calculated the appropriate pace and was executing it without deviation. Ethan said a name. He said it quietly, across the distance of the plaza, in a tone I had never heard from him before. Not frightened, not hard, something between those things. The way a person says the name of someone they once knew very well under circumstances they do not fully want to revisit. The way you might say a name that is attached to a memory that is too large and too complicated to fit into any single feeling about it. The man from the ship stopped walking. He looked at Ethan with an expression that I could read even at distance because it mirrored something in Ethan's own face. Recognition that was also, in some complicated register, grief. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. The kind that confirms something between two people that does not need to be stated aloud because it was already understood by both of them long before this moment. Then Hale spoke. He addressed me directly, which surprised me. He did not have to. He was not here to explain himself to the ruler of the territory he had just invaded. He could have let the next part of the confrontation proceed without giving me any context at all. The fact that he chose to speak suggested either courtesy or the particular cruelty of someone who wanted me to understand exactly what I was watching before I watched it. I am still not entirely certain which it was. Perhaps both. He told me that the name Ethan Cole was not the name my husband had been given at the beginning of his life. He told me that the Ashen Directive was not a hunting party, in the way the word suggested. Not a group of people pursuing one man for simple reasons of vengeance or reclamation. It was, he said, the remnant administration of a program that had once existed on Earth, operating outside conventional authority, designed to identify and develop a very small number of individuals with specific aptitudes for purposes he described, with the careful phrasing of someone choosing their words to minimize their weight, as necessary and unfortunate. He said Ethan had been among the best the program had ever produced. He paused on that point in a way that felt deliberate, not pride exactly, something more ambivalent than pride. He said Ethan had been so effective, so far past what the program's designers had anticipated when they began, that his own instructors had eventually found themselves uncertain about what they had made. He said uncertain was the polite version of the word that had actually been used in the internal documentation. He said Ethan had walked away from the program 11 years ago, not defected to a rival organization, not gone to ground in any location the directive could monitor, simply disappeared, with the completeness of someone who had been trained by the best available people in exactly the skills required to disappear completely. He said the directive had spent every year since then looking for him across systems they had not previously had reason to chart. He said the man who had just stepped off the warship had been Ethan's closest partner during the years of training and deployment. He said they had been paired deliberately, because their skill sets complemented each other, and because the program had found that certain individuals performed better when they had one person they considered genuinely trustworthy. He said they had been, by every measure the program used to evaluate such things, exceptional together. He said the circumstances that had eventually placed them on opposite sides of the question of whether Ethan should be found and returned had been unfortunate. He used that word again. Unfortunate. The word of a man who had learned to describe large human costs with the smallest available vocabulary. I listened to all of this with a cold steadiness that I later understood was not composure, but something closer to my mind running a step behind the information and not yet having caught up enough to feel the full weight of it. In the plaza below, Ethan and the man from the warship had not moved toward each other yet. They were simply standing in the open space between Hale's remaining soldiers and the edge of my forces, looking at each other across what felt like considerably more distance than the physical meters between them. I watched Ethan's face. I had spent 11 years learning to read him, the small signals he did not know he was producing, the shifts that happened beneath the level of what he chose to show. What I saw now was not readable in any way that corresponded to the categories I had developed for him. It was too large for those categories. Whatever he and this man had been to each other, whatever history the directive had produced between them and then broken, its residue was not something that translated into any of the expressions I had learned to recognize in the garden. At the dinner table, across the pillow in the dark, the man from the ship spoke first. Finally, I could not hear what he said from the platform. I only saw Ethan absorb it, and then nod once, very slightly, with the look of someone accepting the terms of something they had hoped to avoid, but had always known was a possibility. Then they moved. What followed is something I have tried to reconstruct accurately many times since, and I consistently run into the same problem, which is that my eyes were not built for the pace at which it happened. I could see them. I could see each of them clearly as individual people. What I could not consistently track was the relationship between their movements in real time. The way each action was generating the response that generated the next action. The chain of decision and counter-decision that was happening faster than my brain's accounting system could keep up with. They were matched. That was the first thing I understood clearly. After watching Ethan move through Hale's soldiers with the quality of something navigating a space it understood better than its occupants, I had arrived at some unconscious assumption about the ceiling of what he was capable of, some upper limit that the engagement had defined. The man from the warship dissolved that assumption within the first 30 seconds. He anticipated Ethan in the same way Ethan had anticipated Hale's soldiers. Not with a fraction of a second to spare, but with the same generous margin that had made the earlier part of the engagement look almost easy. He did not block Ethan's movements so much as answer them before they finished arriving, redirecting with the same fluid economy that Ethan himself used. Two people applying the same fundamental grammar of movement to a conversation, neither was quite willing to stop. For several minutes, neither of them gained any real ground. Vastic had not left the platform since appearing beside me earlier in the engagement. He stood close enough that I could hear him breathing with the controlled steadiness of a man actively managing his own physiological response to what he was seeing. He said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, as though the observation was something he was only half intending to say aloud, he told me that in all his decades of service across conflicts in multiple systems, he had never seen anything like what was happening in the plaza below us. He said whatever program had created these two men had succeeded in a way that would have frightened its creators. He said it with the careful tone of someone who understood that this was simultaneously a military observation and a personal one, directed at the husband of the woman standing beside him. I did not respond. I watched. The turning point, when it came, was small enough that I almost missed it. The man from the warship committed fractionally too much to an attempt to end the exchange quickly. It was the first genuine mistake either of them had made. I could see it in the slightly overextended line of his movement. The weight shifted just past the point that allowed for full recovery. It was the kind of error that only exists as an error because the person on the receiving end has the knowledge to identify and answer it. And most people in the universe would not have had that knowledge. Ethan had that knowledge. He read the movement before it completed. He stepped into the opening it created with the same navigational certainty that had characterized everything I had seen him do in the plaza. And he had his former partner exposed, committed to a direction he could not alter. For the space of something less than a full second, he stopped. The pause was so short that I think most of the people watching from across the plaza did not register it as a pause at all. They saw the exchange continue and resolve and the man from the warship go down, and they understood it as one continuous motion. But from the platform, watching Ethan's face, I saw it. A fraction of a moment where his body had already understood what the next move was, and his mind had put a hand up and said, wait. He made a different choice. What he did instead was controlled and precise and sufficient. His former partner went down onto the plaza stones, unconscious, breathing steadily, his fall guided rather than allowed, placed there rather than dropped. Ethan stood over him for a moment with an expression I will not try to over-describe because I do not have the right words for it. And then he stepped back and straightened and looked across the plaza at Colonel Hale. The colonel's composure had not broken during the engagement. He had watched the entire thing from near the warship with the settled patience of someone who had built a contingency for every outcome he was observing. And none of those contingencies had yet run out. But when the man from the warship went down and Ethan stepped back rather than pressing whatever further advantage the moment had created, something shifted briefly in Hale's expression. Not shock. Something smaller than shock. The recalibration of someone encountering a variable they had accounted for in theory but are now encountering in practice for the first time. He asked Ethan, across the quiet plaza, why he had pulled back. His tone was not contemptuous and not challenging. It was the tone of someone who genuinely wanted to understand the answer. The way you might ask someone why they made a decision that you had considered and ruled out yourself. Ethan answered clearly enough that his voice carried to the platform. He said he had spent 11 years learning that strength was not worth much if a person could not also choose gentleness, when gentleness was the harder option. He said he had left the directive not because he was afraid of what he was capable of, but because he had grown to hate what that capability had cost him every time he used it without restraint. Friendships that became rivalries, purpose that became a life spent running, a version of himself he had stopped recognizing when he saw his own reflection. He said the only thing he had wanted since the day he stepped off a crashed escape pod onto a moon reserved for the dead, and found a stranger who chose not to follow the law that should have ended him right there, was the chance to become someone the directive had not built him to be. He said he was not willing to unmake that choice now, not even for this. The plaza was very quiet. Hale stood near his warship and looked at his remaining soldiers, spread across the stones in various states of incapacitation, and at his best operative lying peacefully unconscious beside them, and at my armed forces surrounding the entire perimeter. And then he looked at Ethan standing in the center of all of it, not triumphant, not defensive, simply present and entirely finished with what had been required of him. For the first time since he had stepped off his ship, Hale looked like a man doing a calculation he had not fully expected to need to do. I did not give him more time to work it out. I came down from the observation platform. Vass caught my arm and said my name once. The way he said it, when he believed I was about to do something he considered operationally inadvisable but had no mechanism to prevent. Soren said something behind me that I did not stay long enough to fully hear. I crossed the plaza on foot, past my own soldiers, past the scattered and quiet aftermath of the engagement, until I was standing in the open space between my husband and the man who had come an impossible distance to take him back. Hale looked at me with an expression that recalibrated slightly again. I had the distinct impression that the role of the ruling consort had not featured prominently in the operational planning for this retrieval. I told him that whatever debt he believed Ethan owed the Ashen Directive had been repaid, not in any formal legal sense but in the sense that actually mattered, which was 11 years of a man choosing, at every single available opportunity, to be something other than what the directive had made him. I told him that the Threnny Dominion stood behind my husband, and that I was not speaking in diplomatic language or making a negotiating position. I was stating a fact that he needed to incorporate into whatever calculation he was currently running. I told him that any further attempt to remove Ethan from Threnny territory would not be treated as a private matter between an organization and a former operative. It would be treated as a direct act of aggression against 40 worlds with the military capacity and the complete willingness to respond accordingly. I said this with my hands steady at my sides and my voice at the same register I used in war councils when I had made a decision I was not going to revisit. Hale looked at me for a long moment. I do not know what he was weighing, whether the calculation was purely military, whether there was something else operating in his thinking after what he had just witnessed in the plaza. Whether some part of him was responding to something beyond the mechanics of the mission. He was not a simple man. Whatever the Ashen Directive was and whatever it had done, the man running it was not someone who had arrived at that position by being simple. He gave the order to withdraw. His remaining soldiers moved with the same coordinated efficiency they had shown arriving, gathering the ones who were down, moving them back toward the warship without urgency and without disorder. The man from the warship was carried aboard with the particular care that soldiers show when moving one of their own, and I noted that Ethan watched this happen with an expression that I understood, even then, was more complicated than simple relief. Within minutes, the warship lifted, silently, without any of the atmospheric drama that our own vessels produced on departure. It simply rose and moved and then was gone beyond our outer grid as though the entire visit had been something our defense systems had chosen not to record. The plaza fell into the kind of silence that follows something large. My soldiers stood with weapons that had come down without being ordered down, staring at the man in the center of the plaza who had, without receiving any support from any of them, resolved the situation that had produced the most comprehensive threat to the Threnny capital in living memory. Their expressions contained things I had never seen directed at Ethan before in all the years he had lived among them. Wariness was there, Awi was there, and something else. Something I recognized as the particular respect that only moves in one direction. From people who know exactly what they are looking at toward the person they are looking at. Ethan was not looking at any of them. He was looking at me. His left sleeve was dark with blood along the forearm, from something that had caught him during the engagement that I had not seen happen in real time. His breathing had settled back toward normal. He was standing in the center of everything that had just occurred with the specific quality of someone who has finished something they did not want to have to do, and is now standing in the aftermath of it, and is not certain yet what comes next. He said, before I could speak, that he was sorry, not for what he had done. He was specific about that. He was sorry for everything he had never told me. Every quiet evening he had allowed me to believe a comfortable version of things instead of the more complicated truth. every small inconsistency I had noticed and chosen, out of love rather than ignorance, not to examine. I stood in front of him in the middle of the open plaza with an entire empire watching us, and I did not yet have the words for what I wanted to say. What I knew, standing there, was this. The man across from me had not been performing a version of himself for 11 years. The gentleness was real. The patience was real. The love for our daughter and for me and for the strange garden he had built in a courtyard of a palace on a world that had not been his was entirely and completely real. He had not hidden who he was. He had simply, for as long as the universe had allowed him, been protecting me from needing to know all of what that included. Behind us, medical staff were moving quietly through the plaza. Ren's tutors were visible at the palace entrance, holding my daughter back from the open courtyard despite her clear intention to go through them regardless. Vask was descending from the platform with the careful movements of a man who had been holding his body tense for a long time and was only now beginning to release it. I looked at my husband, standing in blood-stained clothes in a plaza that was slowly coming back to itself around us. I reached out and took his hand. I did not say anything yet. There was too much to say for any of it to come out right in that moment, and I had learned from him, over 11 years of quiet evenings and unhurried conversations, that some things were worth waiting until you could say them properly. We stood there together while the city found its way back to breathing around us. The palace was different in the days that followed, not visibly. Not in any way that a visitor arriving for the first time would have noticed or been able to name. The corridors looked the same. The council chambers held the same furniture, the same long tables, same chairs worn smooth at the armrests from years of occupation by people working through difficult problems. The garden in the eastern courtyard still caught the morning light the same way it always had, casting the same long shadows across the stone paths that Ren had spent years learning to navigate barefoot without looking down. But the quality of the air inside those walls had changed. Something had been revealed and could not be unrevealed. And everyone who had been present for the revelation was still in the process of working out what it meant for the version of things they had believed before it. I found Ren the evening of the confrontation, in an interior room on the 3rd floor that Ethan had identified as the most structurally reinforced section of the palace at some point during our years here. A detail I had not known he possessed until the 2 guards posted outside her door told me this was where her father had specifically asked for her to be placed before he went to find me. She was sitting on a cushioned bench near the window with the particular posture of a child who has been told to stay away from the glass and has been complying with this instruction while maintaining close enough proximity to it to understand what is happening outside. She looked at me when I came in and asked immediately whether her father was safe. I told her yes. She accepted this with a nod, the way she accepted most information, weighing it briefly before filing it. Then she asked me her second question, the one that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that entire day. She asked whether her father was still the same person he had been that morning. I sat down beside her on the bench and thought about that question with the seriousness it deserved, because she was not asking it as a child asking for reassurance. She was asking it as someone who had watched. From a distance she had not been able to close despite her best efforts. Something happened that she did not yet have the full context to understand, and she wanted an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. She was 11 years old, and she had inherited from her father the particular quality of asking questions she actually wanted the answers to. I told her that I believed he was exactly the same person he had been that morning. I told her that what she had seen from the window was something her father had been before he became the person she knew, not instead of the person she knew. I told her that sometimes people contain more than one version of themselves, and that the version she had grown up with was not a performance or a cover story. It was who he genuinely was. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said that it sounded like he had been very sad before he came here. I told her yes. I thought he probably had been. She said she was glad he had stayed. I held her for a while after that without either of us needing to say anything further, and I thought about how 11 years of watching her father had given her, without any formal instruction in it, an instinct for exactly the right response to almost any situation. She had gotten that from him, not from me. Not from the court around her, not from any of the formal education I had arranged for her, directly and completely from him, simply by being in his presence while he demonstrated it consistently enough that it became her default setting as well. I did not go to find Ethan that evening. I understood. In the way that long familiarity with a person produces understanding without requiring conversation. that he needed the same thing I needed after any day that had taken everything, which was a few hours of not being required to be present for anyone else before we could be present for each other again. I had learned this about him the same way I had learned everything else about him, slowly through accumulated attention and the patience to let the picture develop at its own pace rather than forcing it before it was ready. He was in the garden when I checked, sitting on the low stone wall along the far edge of the eastern courtyard, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of someone who has finished a long task and has not yet quite registered that it is finished. I left him there and went to bed and slept, which surprised me given everything, and understood in the morning that the sleep had been possible because the thing I had been braced against for years, without fully knowing I was braced against it, had finally arrived and passed. Minister Sarin came to me first among the court. She arrived early, which was characteristic, and she sat across from me in the small receiving room I used for conversations I did not want formalized by the council chamber setting, and she opened with the directness that had always been her primary professional quality, saying that she owed me a reconsideration. She said she had spent 11 years believing my marriage was a private indulgence that I had chosen to conduct within appropriate boundaries that kept it from becoming a political liability. She said she had been wrong about both parts of that assessment. She said the confrontation in the plaza had changed the Dominion's standing in the regional system overnight, not because of anything I had said or done, but because word was already moving through every border province and neutral territory and distant system that monitored Threne affairs about what had happened, that an unknown force capable of bypassing the most sophisticated defense network in the region had arrived at the Threne capital and had been turned back, not by our military capacity, not by political negotiation, but by the ruler's consort, alone in the central plaza. She said people were going to want to understand what that meant about us, and that, for the first time in several years, she considered our strategic position to be considerably stronger than it had been the day before. I told her I had not married Ethan to improve our strategic position. She said she was aware of that, and that it had happened anyway, and that this was probably worth noting. She paused then, and something in her expression shifted from the precise professional register into something more personal, which was unusual for her. She said she had been one of the people who had called him my curiosity, my indulgence from the burial moon. She said she had never made this characterization to his face directly, but she had made it freely among the court and had not been careful about whether it reached him. She said she believed it had, because he was considerably more observant than she had given him credit for, which was apparently a widespread failure of perception among people who had known him. She said she thought an apology was probably appropriate, and that she intended to offer him one. I told her he would accept it immediately and without any residual feeling about it, because that was who he was, and she should not mistake that for the apology mattering less. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not quite read, and then nodded and left. Vask's conversation was quieter and took longer. He came to me in the late afternoon, the day after the confrontation, and asked whether I had time for a walk, which was how he framed requests for conversations he did not want recorded in the formal log of my official meetings. We walked the long corridor that ran along the palace's outer wall, where the windows looked out over the lower city, and he spoke with the measured care of a man who had been organizing his thoughts since the previous morning. He told me he owed Ethan an apology. He said he had brought his concerns about my husband to me twice over the years, in ways that he had believed were responsible and that he now understood had been something else as well. He said he had been right that something about Ethan did not fit the story being presented, but that being right about the fact of it had not meant he understood anything real about the nature of it. He said he had been watching for threat. He had been doing his job, which was to identify anything that might constitute a risk to the ruler he served. And he had cataloged Ethan's inconsistencies in that framework and arrived at conclusions that were technically accurate and fundamentally wrong, in the way that accurate conclusions can sometimes be when they are missing the most important piece of context. He said what he had witnessed in the plaza had not been a threat. He said it had been, in his professional assessment, the most extraordinary display of controlled restraint he had ever observed in any combative context in his career, and that the restraint was inseparable from the display, and that he had been so focused on trying to understand the capability that he had completely failed to appreciate the choice that governed it. He said he had spent 40 years believing he understood what strength looked like. He said he was revising that understanding. I told him that I thought Ethan would appreciate the conversation, and that he should have it directly with him, rather than through me. Vask said he intended to, and then was quiet for a moment before saying one more thing, which was that whatever program had made Ethan what he was, had clearly not been entirely wrong in its assessment of what it had found. It had simply failed to understand that the most significant thing about what it had found was not the capability. It was what the person chose to do with it. He did not say anything further after that. We finished the walk in the comfortable silence that comes from two people who have known each other long enough that silence does not require filling. 3 days after the confrontation, I found Ethan in the garden. This was not surprising. The garden was where he went when he needed to think. And he had enough to think about to occupy the entire eastern courtyard, and probably the western one as well. He was kneeling in the far section, working with the careful attention he always brought to the things that required it, his hands moving through the soil with a steadiness that, for the first time since I had walked out onto that plaza, looked genuinely peaceful rather than performed. I sat down beside him on the low border of the garden bed and did not say anything immediately. He continued working for a moment, and then set his tools aside and turned to face me with the directness of someone who has spent 3 days preparing for a conversation and has decided that further preparation is not going to improve it. He told me everything. He told it to me slowly, with the care of someone who has organized a large amount of material and is trying to present it in an order that will make sense rather than overwhelm. He told me about the program, which had existed outside the formal structures of any government or military organization, funded and operated by people who had decided that the conventional mechanisms for addressing certain categories of threat were inadequate, and who had taken it upon themselves to build something they believed would be more effective. He told me about how the program identified candidates, what the criteria were, what the early years of it had looked like for the people inside it. He told me about the training. He was not specific about most of it, and I did not press him to be, because I understood from the way he moved through this part of the account that the specificity was not the point, and also that some of it was not something he was yet able to describe in a straightforward way without the distance of more time. What I understood from what he was willing to say was that it had been thorough in a way that reached further into a person than most training reached, shaping not just skill but instinct, not just technique but the particular way a person reads the world around them, what they notice first, what their body does before their conscious mind has caught up. He told me about the small group of people who had gone through the program alongside him, how that kind of shared experience produces relationships that do not map cleanly onto ordinary friendship, because the people involved know each other at a level that most relationships never reach, having been present for each other in circumstances that ordinary life does not produce. He said these were the closest relationships he had ever had before our family, and that what eventually happened to them was the part of his history that was hardest to speak about. He told me about the mission that had finally broken something in him. He was careful here too. He did not give me all of it. And I understood that the parts he left out were not things he was protecting me from, but things he was not yet capable of saying aloud to anyone, including me. What he gave me was enough. There had been an operation in which the intended outcome had included protecting a specific group of people, and the operation had not produced the intended outcome, and the people had not been protected. He said he had done everything the program had trained him to do, had executed every element of his role without error, and the outcome had still been what it was. He said that was the day he understood that capability without the ability to guarantee its results was not a trade he was willing to keep making. He had left. He had used every skill available to him to disappear in a way that the program could not follow, which was considerable given what the program knew about how he thought and moved and made decisions. He had moved through systems he believed were unmonitored, taking routes that should not have led anywhere near the Dominion space, and eventually ended up on a research vessel whose route happened to pass through a region of space he had not adequately mapped. He said the failure of the escape pod's navigation system had sent him toward the nearest gravitational body without any input from him. And then he paused and looked at me directly and said something I had not expected him to say. He said the crash had not entirely been an accident. He said this carefully, watching my face while he said it, and then explained what he meant. Not that he had caused the crash. The crash was genuine mechanical failure. But he said that when the pod had flagged the available options for emergency landing, he had reviewed them in the seconds available and had chosen the burial moon specifically, not because it was the safest option, because it was the most isolated, the most restricted, the least likely to bring him into contact with people who would have questions about who he was or how he had arrived. He said he had chosen it partly because the chance of anyone finding him there was low enough that survival was not a guaranteed outcome. He said this last part quietly, without drama, looking at his hands. I let the silence that followed sit for a moment before I responded to it. I had heard the weight of what he was telling me, and I wanted to respond to it accurately rather than quickly. I told him that I had been on that moon for my mother, that if he had chosen a different rock, or if the timing had been different by even a small margin, I would not have been there. My scouts would not have found him. The law would have proceeded without any exception. He said he knew that. I said that I was glad he had chosen that particular moon and that particular day, regardless of what had brought him there. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he reached across and took my hand, the same way I had taken his in the plaza 3 days before, and held it with the steadiness that had always been one of the things I loved most about him. The way he held things that mattered to him, as though the act of holding them was something he took seriously. He told me he was sorry for the years of omission. He said it with the precision he brought to apologies, which was always genuine and always specific about what exactly was being apologized for. He was not sorry for protecting me from a history that might have changed how I saw him before I knew him well enough to see it in context. He was sorry for the years I had spent noticing small things and not being able to understand them, for the uncertainty those things must have produced even when I was setting them aside. He was sorry for not trusting me sooner with the knowledge that I had, by that point, more than demonstrated I could be trusted with. I told him I understood the difference between keeping something and hiding something, and that I was going to need some time to work through what I had seen in the plaza before I had the full language for how I felt about all of it. But that time and language were things we had, and I was not going anywhere. He smiled at that, the real smile, the unguarded kind that I had fallen for somewhere in the early evenings of that first year without fully understanding when it had become indispensable to me. The weeks after that were an adjustment rather than a rupture. The court changed, not dramatically, not with any formal shift in how Ethan was addressed or what role he was expected to occupy, but the quiet condescension that had characterized the way most of my court related to him. The slight distance that comes from people who have decided someone is not worth taking seriously was simply gone. In its place was something that Ethan found, by his own admission, considerably less comfortable, which was the quality of attention that people direct at someone they have decided they should be paying attention to. Young officers sought out occasions to be in his vicinity, not approaching him directly, not initially, but positioning themselves where he might be encountered, which he noticed with the same peripheral accuracy he applied to exits and sightlines. He mentioned it to me once with the mildly pained expression of someone who has spent a long time being overlooked and has discovered that being seen is not straightforwardly better. When a particularly direct lieutenant finally asked him outright whether he would be willing to teach some of what he knew, he declined with the same gentleness he brought to most things. He said what he carried was not something that was meant to be passed forward. It was something meant to be set down, as completely as a person was able, and that the best thing he could offer anyone who wanted to learn something from him was the reminder that choosing not to use a capability was as much a skill as developing it in the first place. The lieutenant looked slightly disappointed and slightly impressed simultaneously, which seemed about right. Ren came to him with more questions in those weeks than she had asked in any previous period of her life. She had inherited his patience but not his inclination toward omission. And now that she understood the general shape of what her father's history contained, she approached it with the systematic curiosity she brought to anything she was interested in understanding fully. He answered her honestly, calibrating the detail to what she was ready for without being patronizing about the calibration, which was a balance I watched him manage with the same care he brought to the garden. He told her about the people he had trained alongside, about the particular quality of trust that develops between people who have been through things together that most people never face, about the friend who had stepped off the warship, and what they had meant to each other before circumstances had placed them on opposite sides of a question neither of them had chosen. She asked whether he missed those people. He said yes, in the way you miss something that cannot be recovered whole, only remembered. He said that was one of the costs he had spoken of, and that the cost was real, and that he had decided it was worth paying for the life he had built instead. She said that she thought it was worth it too, and that she was not just saying so because she was his daughter, but because she had thought about it carefully and believed it was true. He told her that careful thinking was one of the things he was most proud of in her. She said she had gotten it from him. He said she had improved on the original. Several months after the confrontation, a message arrived through neutral channels in an encryption format that my communications staff flagged as unusual but not hostile. It was addressed to Ethan specifically, routing information suggesting it had passed through at least 4 relay points before reaching us, which was not the communication pattern of someone making a casual contact. He read it in the garden, alone, in the early morning before Wren came out for her daily hour in the soil. I was watching from the corridor window, not close enough to see the content of whatever device he was reading it on, but close enough to watch his face. He read it through once. Then he sat very still for a moment with the look of someone absorbing something unexpected. Then he read it again, more slowly. When he finished the second time, he set the device down carefully on the garden wall beside him and sat with his hands loose in his lap and his eyes on the middle distance with an expression I recognized as the one he wore when something had shifted that he had not been certain would ever shift. He told me about it later that day. He said it was from his former partner. He said the message did not contain much, that it was not the kind of communication that person would be able to make with any detail given what his affiliation still required of him. But it said enough. It said that watching what had happened in the plaza, and specifically the moment that had ended their engagement, had given him something he had been missing for a long time, which was an answer to a question he had been carrying since the day Ethan had disappeared. He had not understood. The message apparently said why Ethan had left. He had interpreted it for years as abandonment, as a person choosing self-preservation over the relationships and the commitments they had built together. He said seeing Ethan in the plaza, seeing specifically the choice he had made at the moment when he could have made a different one, had finally given him the answer he had been waiting for. He understood now. That was all the message said beyond the logistical details of how it had been routed. Ethan read it twice and then put it away and did not speak of it at length, which I understood was not avoidance but simply the way certain things settle, quietly and without ceremony, the way ground settles after a long rain. Something had been resolved that had been unresolved for 11 years, and the resolution did not require narration to be real. He planted something new in the garden that afternoon, a variety I had not seen him grow before, from a seed he produced from a small pouch I did not recognize. He worked it into the soil with the focused attention he brought to anything he was beginning, and when I asked him what it was, he said it was something that took a long time to produce anything visible but was worth the wait when it finally did. He said it with a small smile that was not performing anything, just genuinely pleased to be starting something new. I think often, now, about the story I built around my husband in those first years, the harmless man from a burial moon, soft and gentle and without a single natural weapon, growing his strange vegetables and apologizing too much and teaching our daughter that kindness was the strongest available option. I believed that story completely, not because I was naive, but because the story was true. It was simply not the whole truth. The whole truth was larger and older and darker in places than the story I had been given access to, and it contained things I am still, if I am being honest, in the process of fully absorbing. There are moments now when I look at him in the garden and see both versions of him simultaneously. The man who placed a paring knife against a servant's wrist in the time it takes to blink, and the man who sat with that same servant the following morning and spent 20 minutes asking about her family, because he had been genuinely concerned about whether she had recovered from the shock. Those two people are the same person. I understand that now in a way I did not when I first had to confront it. He was never harmless. That was not the right word for what I had found on that burial moon. And I think some part of me, the part that kept noticing small things and carefully not examining them, had known this for longer than I was willing to acknowledge. But Harmless had been the story that made daily life feel safe, that made the garden and the quiet evenings and the daughter with his laugh feel like things I could keep without complication. What I actually had was always something more complex and more valuable than Harmless. I had a person who was capable of things I still find difficult to fully look at, who had decided with full knowledge of that capability that a courtyard garden and a daughter's questions about ocean tides and quiet evenings with a woman who ruled 40 worlds were worth more than anything that capability could have produced if he had kept using it. Every single day for 11 years he had made that choice, not passively, not by default, but actively. deliberately, against a history that had given him every reason to remain the thing his training had made him. My court has settled into a new understanding of who he is, or rather, into the understanding that their previous understanding was insufficient. The young officers who once smiled in that particular way about the ruler's harmless curiosity from the burial moon now address him with a careful respect that he finds mildly uncomfortable and that I find, privately, somewhat satisfying. Soren made her apology, which he accepted with immediate warmth, and then redirected toward asking her a question about a policy matter she had been working on. Because he is genuinely incapable of sitting with an apology for longer than the moment required to receive it. Vask had his conversation with him in the garden one afternoon while I was in council, and when I saw them both at dinner that evening. Something in the way they moved around each other had changed in a way I could not have specified but recognized as real. Ren tends the garden with him most mornings now. She asks him about Earth with the consistency of someone building a comprehensive picture, question by question, filling in the details her father is willing to provide. The oceans, the seasons that changed the color of everything, the small brick building where he had stood in front of children who did not always want to be there and had tried to make them understand that history was not something that happened to other people in other times, but something that was still arriving, still being made, by every choice anyone made on any given morning. She asked him once whether he missed teaching. He said that teaching was something you did whenever you had something worth passing on and someone worth passing it to, and that he had not stopped. She thought about this and then said that she supposed that was true, and that she was a much better gardener than she would have been if someone else had raised her. He told her she would have been a remarkable gardener regardless, because she was a remarkable person, but that he was glad to have been there for the starting of it. She told him she was glad too. Then she asked him whether he knew how to propagate the new variety he had planted from the unfamiliar seed, because she wanted to try starting some on her own in the small section of garden he had given her at the beginning of the previous season. He moved over to make room for her beside him and showed her. I watched them and think that whatever the Ashen Directive built, with its programs and its training and its necessary and unfortunate purposes, it never came close to building this. The man kneeling in the soil beside our daughter, patient and unhurried, explaining something small and specific about how a living thing grows, is not something any program designed. He made this version of himself deliberately, out of materials his history provided, and a direction he chose after the history had cost him enough that he understood what he actually wanted. I still rule 40 worlds. I still sit through councils where people measure everything in terms of what can be taken and what can be held. I have not stopped being the person that position requires, and I do not intend to. But I have learned something from the man who came broken onto a burial moon and survived it without any good reason to. Something I did not learn in all the years of preparation my own upbringing and education provided. I have learned that the deepest strength available to a person is not the kind that other people can see. It is not demonstrated in confrontations or measured in conflicts or written down in any record of what someone has done. It is the daily, private, unwitnessed choice to remain gentle in a universe that has given you every possible reason not to be, to grow something in the ground and share it freely, to sit with a child in the morning light and answer her questions as though each one matters, because it does, to hold someone you love with the steady care of a person who understands exactly how fragile most things are and has decided to be careful anyway. My husband taught me that, not in any single moment, not on any particular day, but in the accumulated weight of 11 years of small choices witnessed close enough to understand what they cost him and why he kept making them. I married a man I believed was harmless. What I actually married was someone who loved us enough to let me believe that for as long as the universe allowed. When the universe finally stopped allowing it, he did not become someone new. He simply, for one difficult afternoon, let me see all of who he had always been. I have not needed to revise a single thing about the love that came from that seeing. Only the vocabulary I used to describe it.